Bandwidth for the Wild Paw Dog podcast this week was sponsored by Dougal's Den, www.dougalsden.co.uk. Amazing finds for the furry kind. Everybody, I'm John Buskell.
And I'm Karen Wild.
And this is the podcast that gives you help and advice on how to train your dog. And it doesn't matter if you're an experienced dog owner, if you've just got your first puppy, or you're even thinking about buying a dog. There's something we can all do to make the life we share with our dogs better.
In this week's show, we've got how to teach your dog to fetch and, most importantly, give back.
Oh, that's a really important one, Karen.
It is, and you'd be amazed how many people don't realise that the two go together. A lot of people will say, well, that he'll get the toy, he'll fetch, and then you say, okay, well, but he doesn't bring it back to me, he just runs off with it. So as far as I'm concerned, that's not really a fetch if you haven't got a give at the end of it as well. And some dogs, as you know, will grab hold of something that they want to keep and they will not let it go. So it's really, really important that before you end up with problems that can relate to this kind of thing, that you actually teach it in a fun way, but you teach it properly at the very beginning.
Is this something that you regularly deal with in your training?
It is. And even last night I went to see a family, fantastic family, lots and lots of children, very sensible mum and dad, and they've taken on a rescue deaf Dalmatian. And you would think, if you wanted to give yourself a challenge, do something like that with the number of children that they've got. This is a terrific dog and terrific family, and they've done really, really well with the dog. But what we're learning is that although the dog really likes his food and he really likes his toys, which makes it more possible for him to train, for them to train him more easily, is that when he's got his toy, he gets so terrifically excited about it that he capers around like a mad thing, and they can't actually get him to bring the toy back. Now, that might not be a problem, apart from the fact that they've got young children that are, and some of them are very young, so they might be holding something that the dog decides he wants, and at the moment he's not willingly wanting to give it back. Mm-hmm. So the problems that can stem from it, as you can imagine, are it's not just, he won't bring his toy back, because really that's a low value item for a person, isn't it? But it's more to do with when he's got the toy in his mouth, he runs around like a lunatic, which means if they're trying to get him to come back, i.e., a recall, they are struggling. It means that he doesn't willingly relinquish objects because he wants to hang on to everything, which means they could end up with problems to do with possessiveness. And that's not a good thing either. When you've got lots of items around a home because you've got children in the house, then you really need a dog to be very relaxed about giving things back to you. So when they want to run out and fetch something, some people are very happy about that, but the flip side of the coin is that they might want to take the remote control, your socks, your tea towel. Sometimes these dogs just love to have something in their mouth, so it's absolutely vital that you teach them to give it back.
So how do we start doing this then?
Well, the first thing I think is, our usual beginning of understanding why the dog wants to do it. Because once you've got into your dog's head, you can start to see things from their point of view, which means you can train them really effectively. So the first thing to think about, it is a normal instinct for a dog not to want to give something up that they see as valuable. Mm-hmm. So if they really want it, or you've made a fuss about it so they want it all the more, they are going to desire that object, and they don't pick it up in their paws, they pick it up with their mouth. So the first thing that they want to do, they want that thing. You can compound the problem by making a fuss when they've got it, which is hard not to do when they've got your mobile phone or, one of the children's things. But then, of course, that increases the attention value, the value of the object, the need to have that object. So it might have started off just being quite a tasty item or a smelly item that they were looking at and thinking, that's quite interesting. But then it becomes a bit of a, if you'll excuse the horrible pun, a bone of contention, where you've got something that everybody's paying attention to. It's not about attention seeking alone, though. I think that's a bit unfair, really, because I think some people sort of say, well, he's doing it for attention seeking. But I don't necessarily think that dogs initially start that. I think we create our own monster, because we make a big fuss about it. So the dog learns, oh, well, when I've got my own toy, nobody's really interested. But when I pick up, the tea towel or somebody's glove, then everyone suddenly wants to play. So I'm going to do that again to initiate play. It's not to annoy the person or wind them up or make them late for work. So that's the first thing. Why do they run off with items? Because they think it's valuable and because they just don't want you to take it away from them. Mm-hmm. So once you've got an established habit, it's pretty tricky to deal with. But what you've also got to remember is a dog that wants to hold something in its mouth will quite happily want to hold something else in its mouth instead. And that very much then depends on the dog's value system. So I imagine, John, if you think about your dogs and the different personalities you have, I bet there are some items that they one dog particularly likes or another dog isn't that bothered about. Am I right?
Yeah, that's pretty much the case. I mean, one of the things I was thinking while you were talking about that is the multi-dog household, when one dog takes a bone and, as an initiator to play with another dog, it's not always just a case of, I want this bone for me. And the kind of things that they steal, Digby in particular likes to steal socks. I mean, I think he's a bit of a thief completely, actually. But one thing that I've noticed is that Digby and Stan spent a month in the country with my friend Elsa, who's also got Cora and Dizzy. Dizzy's their sister. And they've been living on a farm for a month, and they have had an amazing time. And I've noticed that in that month, his desire to steal things has diminished, actually. It's almost like that with a larger area. I mean, I've got a pretty large area, but I mean, having the whole stimulation of being able to go into the chicken coop and steal an egg whenever he wants, somehow kind of taken it away from him. I don't know.
Well, there's other more valuable items, but I think in some ways you've hit on the key. The key is, if you're going to get something off your dog, you've got to have something that the dog sees as better, not what you think is better. So it doesn't matter how expensive the thing is that you're holding in your hand. It's got to be dog friendly. It has to be smelly and old and, preferably edible. Now, that doesn't apply for every dog, and it doesn't apply for every problem, because some dogs like to chase and some dogs like movement instead. So we have to work that out. But the first and the best way to start is to start sort of teaching this like formally, but it can be fun. When I say formal, I mean that you've actually made the effort to sit down and train it. I don't mean that you go all stiff and boring and it's sort of very strict. That's not the idea. Now, I would just say, as a little proviso before we start, if you have a dog at home that tends to growl over objects or has what you might think is a possession problem, then probably the following exercises aren't going to be the greatest place to start. What you really need to do before you start is to make sure that you've got some professional advice from somebody who's qualified, who can look at your own individual dog and say, yeah, maybe I would try this, maybe I wouldn't try that. Because what I have found in some cases where, not every day, but cases where the dog is actively growling and sort of guarding objects, that some of the exercises we're going to talk about today can actually make things a little bit worse. So you've really got to have some help before you get started. So that's just my proviso on that, is use your common sense and think, the dog might get really obsessed about this object. So actually that's not a great thing. I'll get a professional trainer in first and just get them to assess, get a behaviourist in to assess what's going on. So, sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, before we get actually into, the practicalities of working with this, is this something that a dog at any age can develop, or is it something that just escalates from a young dog in the sort of early training?
Well, I think it depends on other factors to do with environment rather than age. I think that you might find you can teach dogs to guard from a very early age by the old adage of just, well, I take it off the dog because I'm the dog's master and the dog has to give things up to me. Yeah, but you won't get away with that for very long. One of my fellow behaviourists, Julie Bedford, did a brilliant talk on this not that long ago. And she said, if you're sat there with your meal and perhaps you've got a plate of chips and somebody keeps nicking your chips, it won't take long before you start to get a bit funny about them reaching over with their fingers or their fork. So, you can teach it quite quickly. You can teach it with young puppies if you don't give them a bowl each. If you let them all eat out of the same bowl, you can teach quite quickly that they will what they call resource guarding, which is, this is mine and no one else can have it. So, but at any age you could do that. I've seen rescue dogs that have started to do it, not necessarily that they have or haven't done it before, but because the new owner has taken a tack where, like I described a minute ago, oh, well, the dog should be under my control. I can just take things off it. And the dog might actually just not understand that they're going to get it back. They don't think that. What they think is you're just taking it away. So at any age, you could quite happily teach that. I think as well, you just need to be careful if a dog has a medical problem. We've said this before. Some dogs, for example, if they have a thyroid problem or other problems, or if they're on steroids, they can become, there are side effects and they can become quite hungry, quite thirsty. If they're quite hungry and you start taking things like food off them, then obviously that's going to lead to increased guarding. So again, this is why I'm saying if you've got a dog with quite an extensive problem, they are growling, they are defending, do see a professional first, go and see your vet and get a referral to a behaviourist.
And I mean, that sounds really sensible advice. Okay then, Karen, let's get into the practical side of things here.
Okay, so obviously we're talking about this, but we are teaching humans who can listen, so that's okay. We don't all need to see things. Most people forget when you teach fetch that it's not all about teaching the dog to pick up the toy. The most important part is actually getting them to turn back to you instead of teaching them to disappear. Because most dogs, if they actually want to do anything like this at all, will just grab the toy. So it's not that hard to get them to want to grab the toy if you have a dog that has a propensity to do that. If they're not interested in fetching the toy, then in some ways that can be quite useful because it means you don't have a dog that thieves. If you have a dog that thieves but doesn't want your toy, that's because the toy is not the right kind of toy. So I'm not going to get into that in detail, but I want you to think about the best kind of toy for your dog. Usually soft, smelly, and moves around quickly so you can wiggle it. So raggers, those kind of knotted, twisty things, they're pretty good. Mm-hmm. Balls on ropes, not boring rubber, unless you've got a manic dog, in which case, there are other toys for them. And try and make it the sort of toy that's not too easy for the dog to get hold of and tug on. That's always quite a useful thing to start as well. So pick a time when your dog is in a reasonably energetic mood with few distractions. And then the next thing you have to find, John, which everyone has one, is a corner.
Yeah,
a corner in your house. So why might you need a corner?
Because it's easier to train there because they won't run away.
Yes, they won't run away, and as soon as you toss the toy into the corner, if the dog picks it up, where are they going to go? They're going to have to turn out of the corner. So where I normally sit myself down, depending on the dog, I sit on the floor, usually, if I can. If not, I sit on a chair. If the dog is going to dash past me, I put their house line or just a short lead on them, so they've got that trailing around. So when I start teaching this, I normally sit on the ground with my legs in a kind of V shape facing the corner. Now, I appreciate that's not easy for everybody, and I usually only do that when I've got quite a small dog or a puppy. The other option is to sit on a chair, or if you're in a wheelchair, position it so that you're actually facing into the corner. So if you think you might sit down and never get back up again, you don't have to sit on the floor. But the idea is, if you've got the dog on their lead or a house line, that if they try and dash past you, then you can get hold of them. But it's not really about that. It's about trying to keep them interested in what's going on in the area in front of you. So keep the toy low down. If you're on the floor, that's easy. Wiggle it about on the ground. If you're in a chair, put your hands down low as they'll go without you making yourself uncomfortable, and wiggle the toy around your feet. So the dog is trying to grab at the toy. As soon as you see them try and grab at the toy, toss it into the corner. Right. Now, it might be that your dog is very, very quick, so you might not be able to wiggle the toy around much before they actually try and grab at it. Be aware of that. Make sure you've got a longer toy so they don't grab your hand. Toss it into the corner.
But what if they do? What if
Sorry,
they
carry
do?
on.
What do you do if they do grab your hand or arm? I mean, that's one of the things that I often find is that the dog goes for your arm.
You need to be, and that is absolutely true. You need to be very, very aware that the dog is not chasing after your hand or your arm before you start. So if you think the dog might do that, you need to be looking at teaching an off command, which I've got in a separate. I don't think we've got it in a separate podcast, but I have got it on a separate handout. Hands and arms are not toys. So you have to be aware that you're trying to direct the dog onto the toy and not onto your arm or your hand. So if you've already taught the dog to play with your hand or your arm, then that's a separate problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
if it's a longer toy, I mean, you can get raggers that are a good couple of feet long. If you look for them, you can get something that's very, very long, and the dog is not distinguishing between your hand and the toy if they are grabbing at your hand. So you need to go back to, it's incomplete training from your puppyhood training, which is, the ouch and the people's skin is not for teeth contact at all. So you have to go back to that. You wiggle the toy around, keep your hands out of the way. So if you've got a longer toy, your hand will be out of the way. But make sure that the dog is going for the toy and not for you. And like I say, if the dog is going for you, you need to stop this exercise and go away and teach the dog not to grab your hand separately. And that is the off command. So that is slightly different. But let's assume you're sitting there, you're wiggling the toy around, the dog's about to grab it. The second you see them about to grab it, you toss it into the corner. Now, because the dog runs for the toy in the corner, or they should do if they saw it go, then you can immediately say fetch as soon as the dog puts its mouth on the toy. So that is the point at which I like to say fetch, because fetch means to me, pick up the toy to begin with. Okay, so it means put your mouth on the toy. So if the toy is then static and sitting 3 or 4 feet away, I can say to the dog, fetch, and the dog knows, go and put my mouth on the toy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
So then keeping the excitement going, and depending on how excitable your dog is, you know, you might need to be more excitable if they're a bit flat, or you might need to really tone it down if the dog is very, very wound up. So, you know, very wound up means you be very flat and vice versa. So fetch, and then as the dog picks it up in its excitement, you know, clap your hands, pat your leg, come on then, tap your fingers on the ground, pat, 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 to try and keep the interest in the dog's movement, and the dog will turn out of the corner. Now, they may just come straight back to you because you're making lots of inviting noises. They may just think, woohoo, I've got my toy, in which case they'll try and dive over your leg or nudge past you. If they do that, you take their house line, you draw them back to you, but immediately start playing with them with the toy and tell them what a great dog they are. Mm. So the reward is coming at the point of the dog landing at your lap. And the reward is not taking the toy off the dog. That is not the reward.
That's interesting.
The reward is, the reward has to be playing with you with the toy. Because if that's the biggest reward, the dog is always going to want to do that again and again, yeah?
Yep, and it's not food.
So it's not food. You can use... Basically, the idea is you're teaching the dog to fetch the toy. If the dog loves the toy, they're going to love the movement of the toy. They're going to love the game with the toy, and you are participating in that game. So that in their head is what's happening. You then need to think about how to get the toy off the dog so you can throw it again. Now, some dogs will actually release the toy quite quickly. Some dogs will not. You need to either have another toy of equal or better value that you can swap, which I would go for first, and I would try that first. So I would immediately start wiggling the other toy about on the floor and see if the dog distracts from the toy they've got in their mouth and tries to get the other toy, at which point you then throw it and do the same exercise again. So as they put their mouth on that toy, you tuck the other toy out of the way, you say fetch, clap your hands, pat your legs, come on, like that, wiggle that toy around, and then swap back to the other toy. That is the best way to do it. However, if the dog doesn't want the other toy, you need to have some food ready. You put the food on the dog's nose, and the food goes to the left, and the toy goes to the right. So the dog's nose follows the food, and then you can get the toy out of their mouth. Now, that all sounds very complicated, but actually, if you see it and you do it yourself, it's a very quick process. The problem with using food, and I would say this straight away, is that some dogs are most focused on the food and they won't want the toy again after you've used the food. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you've had one good fetch and one good release, and that's really what we're after, isn't it?
Yeah, that sounds really excellent, Karen, because I mean, one of the things that I struggle with is getting my dogs to play fetch. Winnie will do it, and I taught her this way, but I've not thought about because I've always used food as a motivation, and of course Bassets being Bassets, they do focus on the food. The one question that I had though was, when the dog is in the corner and you call the dog back to you, you know, you were like saying, come on, and patting your legs and stuff. Do you use a different recall cue than the one that you use, you know, when you've trained, you know, come back to you?
Well, the purist would say that you don't use the command until you've got the behaviour. So, you know, you could, at the moment, you're just kind of making lots of squeaky noises and going, come on, like that, to get the dog to attend to you. When they get that pattern, then you can start to label it. As the best clicker trainers would say, you know, you get the behaviour and then you label it with a command. So if you're saying whatever your recall command is that previously hasn't worked when the dog's got a toy in its mouth, what the dog might have associated is, oh, that means you're going to take the toy off me, so I'm going to try and jump over your head or dash past your leg as fast as possible. So you need to be very aware. Fetch is happening, you know, as you speak, as the dog's mouth is on the toy. Then make a fuss so the dog comes back to you. And then when you've got that pattern, either fetch becomes fetch the toy and bring it back, which is a very neat and easy command, or if you're going to use a recall command, you say whatever your recall word is, but the dog has to understand, oh yeah, when I go back, that means that.
Sure.
Do you see what I mean? So if
Yeah.
you're going to say come, the dog has to be doing it first.
I think also
So you're training it.
I think also for me, it would make sense to have a different word because my recall cue is associated with a food reward. And
Yeah. I mean, for me, fetch for my dogs, and this is why I'm always saying, you can say banana for all I care, fish and chips as a command. It doesn't really matter. But the important thing is that the dog understands what you mean. So for my dogs, when I teach fetch means go out, get that, bring it back to me, put it in my hand. That's what it means. It means all of that. But I don't expect the dog to learn that all in one go. So I break it down. So the first stage, which we're talking about now, put your mouth on the toy. That means fetch means put your mouth on the toy. The next part of it means bring it back to me. So I can say an extra command if I like, but I don't really need to because I've stepped the command up into, okay, I've put the toy out there. You've done this 10, 20, 30 times coming back to me now. Every single time we've done the same thing into the corner. So the dog knows the pattern. So the dog will start to understand. You say fetch just before you throw the toy after a little while, and then you say fetch and then you throw the toy, and then the dog brings it back to you, and then it has its game, and then you start the game again. So what you've actually done is faded out all the extra help that you've been giving right at the start.
Ah, right, I see. And what happens if your dog's not interested in toys at all?
Pat yourself on the back and think that you're not really ever going to have a problem. That's not actually true. That's not true at all. But I did have a dog that I rescued. He'd never played with anything. So I went to a dog training class and I was told to use food or toys to train him, and he wasn't responsive to food or toys at all. With hindsight, I think he was probably quite stressed by the training class, and this was 17 years ago, so we weren't all up on that sort of thing. He did a lot of barking. I was told to squirt him with water, and but he wasn't interested in toys even at home. So I had to formally teach him to do it. And what I used to do, because that was the only way I had of sort of training him, I used to ignore him totally until he was all kind of quite excited. So perhaps when I came in from being out, so when he was all quite bouncy, and I got a rabbit skin, so an actual rabbit skin that a friend was using for tying flies for fishing.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me a piece of rabbit skin. And I used to wiggle that around on the floor for about 2 seconds, enough for the dog to kind of want to sniff it and move his head a bit quickly. And then I used to put it away. And I did that every single time I came in from work or wherever for about 3 weeks. And eventually the dog kind of tried to grab it. So it took me that long to kind of awaken this instinct. So I would say, you can do it. You don't necessarily have to. I eventually, I had this little dog playing fly ball and things like that. And he would do it, but he kind of did it under duress a bit, which is a bit of a shame, really. I probably wouldn't do that nowadays. But, if the dog doesn't really enjoy it, that's fine. If they are a thieving dog that doesn't want to play with your toy, that's different. And I would say, yeah, work on it, because you'll find that one instinct is the same as the other, what we think is the other. If they're interested enough in objects to run off with them, then they should be interested enough in something that you've got. So it means that the object you've got isn't as interesting. So you have to make it more interesting.
Yeah, get a high octane.
High octane. Like I say, I used rabbit skin. It must have smelt very leathery, and it was fluffy. And then I moved to a soft sheepskin sort of squeaky toy. Again, this was a terrier, so he's quite keen on that. The best fetch toys for a dog that isn't keen, don't bother with rubber sort of toys that don't hold any scent. Really, they're not the best thing to do. But for a manic dog that really wants to grab, get something on a rope. Or there's a toy that I'm going to find a picture of it. I saw it on the D4Dog forum website not that long ago. It's like a multi-angled toy. It's very hard for a dog to hold on tight to one of those. And I used to have one of those for my collie, who was a manic retriever. And you can get them out of their mouth quite easily. But the next part is the give. So let's move on to that.
Okay.
So we've got this nice little routine fetch play thing, and we've got a nice exchange going on at the end of it, hopefully. But it might be that that's actually quite difficult for you to achieve. So we need to look at that separately. And I want everyone who's teaching this to go, perhaps do the fetch thing, but then stop doing that and then go on and teach the give separately, because it's really important that you differentiate the two and then bring them together. So as you can see, we're building up stages here. So what you really want is for the dog to drop the toy or item, whatever they've got, into your hand, preferably, with the word give. Now, I don't say drop as a command. And the reason I don't say that, and I don't teach my clients that, is because they can get very frustrated with it. They will go, drop, and the dog doesn't drop it. And they go, drop, drop, like that. And it becomes quite an aggressive thing. And the dog's thinking, now you're scaring me. I'm not letting go. So give is more of a give. It's hard to, I don't know, I'm sure people could yell it, but it's hard to be aggressive over a give word. Give, thank you very much. Give. You could say thank you. That's always quite nice. So again, think about how you're coming across to the dog. Don't challenge the dog, because the dog will probably win. What's the point? Why challenge your dog? You can get things in other ways. So allow the dog. So we're talking about a manic sort of retriever here that doesn't really want to let things go. So allow the dog to hold the toy in its mouth, but make sure you've got a delicious piece of food somewhere, preferably between your forefinger and thumb in your hand, but it could be about your person or in a pot next to you or something like that. So the dog's holding onto the toy. Now, if the dog's quite food oriented anyway, normally they spit the toy out to smell the food, but they might not do that. So you hold the food in front of the dog's nose, and I mean on its nostrils. I don't mean above its head or on its mouth. The dog needs to smell the food. So when the dog then sniffs the food, generally, if they're interested in what you've got in your hand, and it's got to be nice food, not biscuit, not a bit of its dog food. That's not going to work. It needs to be something like cheese or chicken or ham or liver cake or dried up hot dog. You're not going to give them a lot, but it needs to smell strong. So as soon as the dog starts to sniff at it, generally, not always, but generally the dog will kind of start to sniff and spit the toy out to take the food. So as soon as they do that, the second they kind of stick their tongue out and go plur with the toy. That's a very technical description, isn't it? You say plur. If you could see me, you'd see me sort of poking my tongue out. You say the cue word give them the food, and at the same time with your other hand you pick up the toy. So it's kind of a nice combination approach. You hold the food there, the dog spits the toy out. As they spit the toy out, you say give and quickly pop the food in their mouth. So they're learning to spit the toy out because they're going to get something better. So hopefully that pattern makes sense. It's also really helpful, as I mentioned a minute ago, to lure the dog's nose to one side as you say give. So the toy kind of drops preferably into your hand, but it might not, but you can hold your hand underneath the dog's chin, food in the nose, on the nose, not in the nose. Move the dog's head slightly to the side so that as they spit out the toy will drop down into your hand, or you might just be able to take the toy to the other side. But try and keep the dog's nose moving away from the toy. What some dogs will do, you see, is as they see the toy vanishing over to the left or the right, they will try and grab hold of the toy because they think they're dropping it or they think they're losing it. So you must distract them with the food for quite a while. Make sure you've got the toy and then pop the food in their mouth. So I realise I'm describing this in audio, but it shouldn't be that hard for people to suss out, okay, one has to exchange for the other. The cue is give, the really important part, give as soon as that toy starts to spit out. And don't be afraid to just trade food for toys or objects that your dog has stolen for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. It doesn't matter. If your dog has, somebody's hearing aid in its mouth and the hearing aid is worth 400 quid and all you have to do is go and get a bit of hot dog out of the fridge, that's a cheap exchange. You're not bribing the dog or buying the dog's favour or trying to bow down to the dog. You're getting the hearing aid out of its mouth and you're rewarding yourself for being a better trainer.
It seems to me that training at home is the place to start because you've got the corner. And then I think that, I would want to train it maybe outside within the home setting, if you've got a garden where you can train, and then to train it on a walk so that you perfect or shape and really elicit the behavior that you want. And then you move on into different milieux. So eventually, this will even take place and will work when you've got lots of people around you. Because I could also see that, in a family situation, if the house is really full, the dog's looking for attention, this is one of its favorite sort of games. It might,
I think you've always got to have your management things in place as well with a dog. That if you've got a dog that's pre-thieving, and like I say, I think if you've got a dog that has a real theft problem, you need a professional to help you, because dogs can quickly, if you confront them and they've got something in their mouth, they will quickly start to swallow it or damage it quite quickly, or run off and hide and then guard the space they're hiding. So, we're not really talking about that kind of angle today. What we're talking about is prevention, really, rather than a cure. You can cure it with these methods, but I wouldn't just recommend applying them willy-nilly. You need to know what you're doing. The learning process is quite clear for the dog. The dog needs to feel very relaxed about things in its mouth. It needs to feel very relaxed about you and anyone else being around it while it's got things in its mouth. And it needs to feel that if it lets go of something, it's going to get something better. But that doesn't mean to say that if the dog doesn't want to let go of it, you're just going to go, oh, okay, chew it up then. What you need to work out before you start to give your dog that kind of freedom is how reliable your dog is in certain areas. So if you know that your dog is a bit of a thief and you know that you're struggling, you would manage the situation. You wouldn't just let them have completely free range action to everywhere in the house, and you wouldn't leave valuable stuff down on the floor, or on the table or on the worktop. You learn to manage the environment until you've got the problem sorted out. And I know that's a pain in the bum. I understand that. But, dogs are dogs and we live with them. We choose to share our lives with them, and they are opportunists and they will grab things. So, I would say if you've got a dog that's starting to look like it's got a bit of a persistent problem, maybe not a big problem yet, you don't feel ready to get someone in to help you, but there's nothing wrong with putting a house line on the dog. So if the dog heads for something, you can call them away before they get to it. You can give them a reward for coming back to you. If you're doing the corner training, for example, you start in one place, you gradually extend it. You extend it to, you move away from the corner, so you've got a bit further away, then you choose a corner somewhere else, then you'd use like a U shape in a room, then you might play in the garden, but you don't just take the dog off the lead, you might put it on a line so you can reliably bring the dog back to you each time. And that applies more and more the further out and about you get. So if you know you've got a dog that once they've got the toy in their mouth, they're going to run off, you don't give them that freedom. So you do have to work on this as a kind of ongoing training, I suppose not really a problem, but it's part of your dog's education. That's what we're there for. It's a natural behavior for a dog to grab things and disappear and not want to give them back. That's normal. So we are the only ones that get het up about it. So therefore we have the responsibility to teach the dog what we want and make it rewarding for us both. And then there's no contest. What a great way of negotiating. It's a really, really easy thing to do.
I think what this, draws attention to is the sort of the holistic nature of dog training. That, getting used to your dog, working with you, getting used to your dog being, showing the right kind of behavior when you're handling food in front of the dog, the recall, the significance of the recall, that working in the home environment before taking that training outside the home. I mean, I think that's one of the things, particularly if you're a new listener to the show, if you haven't got a dog yet and you're trying to find out more about what's involved with owning a dog, this is one of the things that Karen and I try and get across in the show.
Yeah, and I think I don't know how many of you listened to the interview with Jean Donaldson, very, very well known, very, very good trainer, in the last podcast. But she talks about using food with training, for example, where a lot of us are almost, we mustn't use food, it's a really bad thing, and you're giving in to the dog, and that whole attitude is flawed. You can get rid of the food lure, and in the handout that accompanies this podcast, which you can get from my website, and we'll tell you details about that at the end. But I talk about how to get rid of the food lure, but you don't need to get rid of it forever. And you don't need the dog to give things to your hand. It doesn't mean they're disrespecting you if they don't. It doesn't mean anything like that. It's all about your attitude to your dog and how well you've trained it. And I know that I can get really naggy about this, so apologies. But, if the dog's not doing something you want it to do, change something you're doing so that the dog can change what they're doing, because one feeds from the other, and it's really important to have responsibility for that.
Well, Karen, is there anything else that we can do or use to teach our dogs to fetch and give?
I think, again, if you're having problems, you've got to look at the value system. What is the value of the reward? What is the reward? Is it the chase? We haven't really addressed that now, but have you got a dog that actually prefers the chase? In which case, the reward is going to come fast.
And we're back.
So I think the biggest thing to remember is the dog's value system. If the dog doesn't want the reward, you've got to think, what is the reward? What am I offering? What is the dog getting out of this? And also, what are you getting out of it? If you're getting from a lot of work very little reward, then you need to look at, are you doing too much work and letting the dog not do enough? Or are you thinking, okay, I don't want the dog to steal valuable items anymore. This is going to take me a few months, but at least I'm getting something out of it in the end. So when you're thinking about what to do, I've given you the very basics just now. It is the basics. The basics are there in front of you. Once you start to understand, oh, my dog actually likes this, my dog does that, you become the expert on your dog then. So you can take tips from people if something's not working, change it, but change it in a way that you are working with your dog for your dog's reward system. So it's really helpful to make a list of the things your dog loves. And, it might be that your dog likes the chase part of the exercise rather than the retrieve or the game at the end, in which case the quicker they bring the toy back to you, the quicker they get their chase. So the dog might understand that as the reward. So try and analyze it a little bit. Don't just pick up a textbook explanation and think my dog should do it like this, because every dog does something different, and it helps to know your dog. And then when someone tries to tell you, well, I've tried this with my dog or I've tried that with my dog, remember it's your dog. So you're the expert on your dog, and that's how it should be.
Karen, you mentioned a handout to accompany this episode of the Wild Paw Dog Podcast. Tell us more about the handout.
The handout is called Fetch and Give. Let's not forget one without the other. The handout it's about 7 pages long of A4. It's like a mini ebook really, and you can download it from the site. It's only $2.99. I can't remember what that is in dollars, and my apologies. I'll put that on the blog for you as well. I'll put a link. So basically you can have it as an instant download, and it goes through step by step what we've talked about in the podcast, plus some extra bits of information that you should find really useful. And it means that you can refer back to it as well. It's gone down very well with people that I've done trialing it. The method is quite straightforward, but I think it helps to have a kind of paper copy. So if you did want to download that, the link is on the blog. And you can go and get that. And also there are other chapters. We call them chapters because you can actually build up your own dog training manual that's suited to your dog if you want to. And I think if you buy more than 3, you get quite a big discount. But the Fetch and Give handout is the one that we're really talking about today. And I just think that it's well worth investing if you've got a new puppy or an older dog that really needs to learn a bit extra. This is one of the really useful ones.
I'd just like to point out that if you're listening to the show, that Karen and I do this for absolutely free. So buying one of the handouts that Karen puts together is a great way of showing your appreciation and helping us keep doing the Wild Paw Dog Podcast.
If you go to my website, which is www.intellidogs.com, INTELLIDOGS.com. There's also all of the blogs that we do alongside these podcasts, and they are free. There are free tips and advice on there as well. So please do visit and have a play, have a look around, leave us a comment if you want to, and also, do you know something, John? We have not had a bark sent to us for a while. So where are those barks? I know the dogs are out there. You keep writing to me about them. So record your dog or dogs having a bit of a bark, send it in, and we will play it on the podcast for you.
Yep, and you can send that to podcast@intellidogs.com. Or if you want to get in touch with us on Twitter, you can look for us. Karen's Twitter address is twitter.com/wildpaw. And I'm twitter.com/John Buskell, JONBUSCALL. And remember, we'd love it if you write a review of the show on iTunes. It's a great way of getting more people to listen to the show and growing the community of people who want to improve their lives that they share with their dogs. Karen, it's been a while since we talked. We've had a couple of interviews. What have we got coming up in the next few weeks?
Well, we have some great stuff, actually. I mean, I've got this kind of catalogue now of brilliant people. I'm talking later to Nicole Wild, who is a very well-known trainer over in the US, about separation anxiety. I've talked to Grisha Stewart, who does the BAT training, which is to do with... it's behaviour adjustment training, which is to do with getting dogs that are fearful or other things, getting them used to being in closer proximity with dogs, people, so for reactive dogs, Brilliant, brilliant lady, brilliant courses. And she's been over here, so I was very lucky to talk to her. I've got a great interview with Maureen Howard Boyardi, who was on Radio 2 and absolutely slammed a shock collar manufacturer not that long ago. So we've got that coming up as well. And also we've got our puppy series. So we've got an awful lot coming. And here at Wild Port Towers, I'm starting puppy classes in the autumn as well. So I've got an awful lot of projects to work on at the moment.
If people want to find out about those puppy classes, where do they go, Karen?
You can either go to my main site, which is karenwild.co.uk. That's probably the best place to go. There would be a link back from the IntelliDogs site as well. But if you're local to me and you want to bring your puppy and do a bit of training, we're going to have a lot of fun, and it's starting in September. So just have a look there, or contact me via the blog and I will give you information on that. And we're based sort of Peterborough-ish area in the UK.
Yeah, I was going to say, whereabouts are you in the UK? So Peterborough-ish. Yeah. All right then, Karen, I think it's that's about it for this week. Just remember, if you love the show, it would be great if you voted for us at the European Podcast Awards. We've been nominated.
Oh, yeah. And we've been nominated. How exciting.
So that would be really cool. And we'll include a link to the website for the European Podcast Awards at the end of this blog post. So we'll be back very, very soon with another edition of the Wild Paw Dog Podcast. And until next time, Karen.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I'd love to hear from you. So please write into the show. Oh, and thank you, Terry, for all your help this last week. There, I just had to give her a mention.
All right, then. Bye now.
Bye.
IntelliDogs.com, because dogs have people.